Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again David McAlvany. He's been with us before, and for the sake of brevity and because we have such limited time, I'm not going to read his bio right now. It's a very impressive bio that's posted at the Voice America Business Channel website. He is the president of the McAlvany Financial Companies, and he's had a wealth of experience in his young life, and so we're really pleased to have you with us again, David. Thanks for joining me.
Jake, great to be back with you.
Always good to talk to you. I've listened to several of your shows. I want to tell our listeners right away to go to McAlvany.com. There's a lot of very interesting and important information there. And, of course, you also provide a service, various services, investment services, and you do, I believe, make available precious metals as well that people can purchase. Isn't that right, David?
That's correct. Yeah, the business has been going since 1972, and I would encourage any of your listeners to explore weekly commentary. It's a good way of getting to know us, and subscribe for free. It's a Wednesday commentary, and as you mentioned, if you go to McAlvany.com, you can navigate to that, and we'd love to have you as a regular listener.
Yeah, I would really recommend that people do go there to listen to it. In fact, one of the reasons I wanted to get David on the show today was to talk a little bit about a show that aired on his site on the 30th of July titled The New Cold War, Russia and Gold. Certainly, we talk to Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity on this show on a regular basis, and so we are getting a perspective that's quite different from the mainstream perspective from Daniel and from Ron Paul. And in listening to David's commentary the other day, or that is on the 30th of July, realized there's a great deal in common, I believe, on many fronts, but possibly also on the geopolitical front. You know, David, in your July 30th show, you referred to a string of crises that culminate in geopolitical crises. And I think, if I remember, you talked about a financial crisis that leads to an economic crisis that leads to a domestic political crisis, and then on a larger scale, geopolitical crisis. And, you know, we've had people on this show like Larry Edelson, David Gurwitz of Charles Nanner, and so forth, that are talking about an increase in the war cycle, a war cycle that they see based on their work over a long period of time. Now, it was about 5 years ago, only 5 years ago or so, that we had this horrendous stock market decline, and followed by, well, it was the worst stock market decline since the 1930s, and a decline in our economic well-being that I would argue we've barely come out of yet. But can you help our listeners sort of connect the dots between our financial crisis back there and what might be going on geopolitically now?
Absolutely. I think it's important that we appreciate how interconnected the world is. And although, you know, in a university education, we are taught to think in terms of strict categories where economics is one thing, finance is another, history is another, and everyone has their unique specialization. In the real world, all of these things bleed into and cross over each other. And so what we had 5 years ago in terms of a financial crisis, for us it was very clear where we were going. This has been a framework we've worked with for probably 7 or 8 years now in terms of anticipating a financial crisis and seeing how what would start in a banking setting would ultimately trickle into the economy, creating political problems, and then ultimately what we do know about politicians, and this is just again from a study of history, politicians very rarely like to take responsibility for bad policy choices. So you see the blame game in sort of the final round, and that's where you begin to see geopolitical crisis emerge. Again, after sort of the domino effect from a financial crisis to an economic crisis to a domestic political, and then ultimately to a geopolitical crisis. You could say, well, there is no causal effect here. No, it's just human nature and an unwillingness for politicians to say, listen, I got it wrong, and I'm willing to take the blame for it. So that's what we have today is fingers pointing, and frankly, what we see developing in both the Middle East and in the Caucasus is very concerning.
Yeah, it is very concerning. So what you're saying, if I understood what you just said, is that politicians are looking for scapegoats, perhaps, and we have a very, very wretched economy here in the United States, I think, although the mainstream tries to paint it as something better than I think it is. So then we're looking to scapegoats. Putin is the reason we're having trouble.
Yeah, I think it's moving that direction, and you know, it's a little bit of kabuki theater. If we can distract you and make you look over here, and see that there's greater concern and greater conflict, you're not going to blame me, the politician, for what really is a domestic issue. We've got fiscal policies which are train wreck. We've got monetary policies which are a train wreck, and of course everyone believes that we've already seen the death of inflation, which I think is patently insane. But nevertheless, that is the general consensus today, is that we've already witnessed the death of inflation, and at best we see it as dormant. Why? Again, we've got fiscal policy and monetary policy that's run amok, with the comeuppance still in sort of a 2015, 2016 time frame for everything that we've put into the pipeline already.
David, we supposedly won the Cold War, and it was generally agreed that capitalism triumphed over socialism, and many people also believed that the West had a higher moral standing with a belief in a creator that was at the heart of the freedom and liberty that we enjoyed. Our founders certainly voiced that view in the Declaration of Independence. And in a book I read recently, I just picked it up in my library, I almost forgot that I had it, written by a close friend of Ronald Reagan, a registered nurse named Mary Beth Brown. She talks about Reagan's deep faith in God and how that tempered how he handled foreign affairs, and the author of the book believed that it made a huge difference in the way he led our nation. And do you buy into this idea that America triumphed over the Soviet Union, that capitalism prevailed over socialism, first of all? And then do you think there might have been, a higher moral ground, arguably, that the West was operating under at that time?
Well, to some degree, we did triumph over socialism, and then forgot how to define those terms and embraced a higher degree of socialism here in our own policies. In fact, it was Pravda just about 2 or 3 years ago that said, in sort of a confusing, scratching the head moment, I thought it was us that was supposed to be socialist in reflecting on current U.S. Fiscal policy. They just said this is completely socialist. So again, I mean, when the Russian propagandists are looking at us and saying you're more socialist than we ever were, I think something has shifted. So perhaps what we had during the 80s was sort of the last vestiges of a vision of freedom, and now what we have is certainly a concept of safety and of preservation of a particular life, which we're willing to sacrifice anything for. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing freedoms go out the door, and we're substituting many of them for socialism. So I'm not so sure that we can regain that same vision of freedom under the current leadership, or frankly, I'm not seeing much of a difference between Republicans and Democrats anymore in terms of what their vision of freedom looks like.
No, unfortunately, I think we'd have to agree with that. I'd like to go to the Ukrainian situation a little bit here and get your take on that, because you talked about that in that show on July 30th, and I would suggest to my listeners to go back and listen to that, because there's a lot more that David and his co-host talked about than we can talk about today. But it's my understanding, David, that through covert means the U.S. essentially toppled an elected government in the Ukraine. I don't think anybody disputed the veracity of the elections. I don't know. But in any event, it was an elected government that we covertly toppled. It was a government that and a leader that was more pro-Russia than pro-West, perhaps. But anyway, he's been deposed, and in comes another person of our liking that we, I suppose, had something to do with putting into power. Why are we constantly meddling? Why do you think we're meddling in the Ukraine? What's the motivation for this, outside of possibly the one that we talked about earlier, the notion that it's a little kabuki theater?
Well, let's consider Putin's perspective on this. As Russian KGB, he understands military history and that region's history of conflict going back not just decades but centuries. And it was this 1,000-mile buffer that is the Ukraine today. It wasn't the Ukraine, 100 years ago, but it kept the Germans and it kept the French from rolling into Russia. And so there is this long history of having this land buffer. Mm-hmm. It was good enough having a very corrupt, very, you could say, despicable Yanukovych in office in Ukraine, mm-hmm. but he had sympathies towards Russia, and so Putin was comfortable with that. He didn't have to like him personally or check a box morally. he had sympathies towards Russia, and that was enough for Putin for him to consider that land buffer sufficient. Now Yanukovych is yanked out. Our State Department and CIA had some dealings in that, and of course the election process was very rapid, bringing in his successor, and his successor is very pro-Europe and pro-United States. That makes that 1,000-mile land buffer a historical point in the past, and it's very uncomfortable for Putin. So this is, I think, why he's reestablishing or reasserting some military presence, not only in the eastern part of Ukraine, but even Crimea before that. We have perhaps overplayed our hand, and we're surprised that he has a response to this. Well, he does have a response to it, and it does tie into Russian history. This was the 1,000-mile barrier that kept the Germans and the French, and he thinks it's going to keep NATO at bay as well. But unfortunately, now we have Britain spearheading a 10,000-strong NATO reaction, and we've got Denmark, Latvia, Estonia, Norway, and the Netherlands throwing in to help. So yes, this is to some degree a reemergence of the Cold War. NATO has a new spring in their step, almost became irrelevant, and now they have something to fight against again.
I think you talked a little bit about energy coming into the equation as well. Would you care to just expound on that a bit?
Sure. Europe is dependent on Russian oil. I think everyone knows that. The one workaround, there's several pipelines that go through Armenia and Azerbaijan, and are capable of million and a half barrels per day, and this would be taking Caspian Sea oil and delivering it through Turkey to Europe around circumventing Russia. So it's not a surprise at all in the context of seeing, sort of the questions of energy security for Europe, to all of a sudden see an old conflict reemerge in that area. This goes back to the early 90s when Armenia took territory that was held by Azerbaijan, and there was a secession that took place in actually 1988. 30,000 people died in that conflict, and it ultimately was resolved with international help in 1994. But now we've got soldiers fighting in this contested area, the contested area in Nagorno-Karabakh, and the significance here is that it's just a stone's throw away from the Baku-Tbilisi-Sion pipeline. This is the pipeline which carries oil and bypasses the Russian energy stranglehold, if you will, on its way to Europe. So the fact that you now have the Armenians, which are backed by and supported in alliances with Russia in this contested space against Azerbaijan, who is supported by the United States, these alliances, frankly, remind me of sort of 1914 and the smallness of the conflict, but the deepness of the commitment that was made in terms of international alliances. Those alliances right there that relate to the Baku-Tbilisi-Sion pipeline, I think, are a tinderbox.
Well, you mentioned the intensity of these issues. How far do you think Russia is prepared to go to? I mean, because this is really important, as you say, maybe for the sovereignty of Russia as they see it, and also this economic issue that comes into play. It's very, very important to Russia. How far do you think they're willing to go to try to defend their interest?
It really depends on what we try to do to hammer the price of oil. I mean, you go back to the ways in which we destroyed the former Soviet Union. One, we outspent them in the arms race, and Star Wars was a major component of that, creating a context of fear for them in which they felt they had to spend, and we were spending too, and we had, frankly, deeper pockets. But the other part of that, by the time we got to the final breakup, you're dealing with oil prices in collapse and an inability for the state to fund itself. We're on a knife's edge, the Russians are anyways, because you need $110 to $115 per barrel Brent crude to fund the state, and they don't have that today. So it's not they're not bleeding terribly, but let's say that oil got down to $70 a barrel or $60 a barrel. Now you're talking about bankrupting the Russian state, and I think you will more likely see aggressive behavior. So I think our foreign policy on this point and our energy policy specifically, has a lot to do with how aggressive they become. If we decide we want to take them out of the equation and bankrupt them, we may end up creating World War IV.
It's World War IV. I didn't know we had World War III.
Well, I consider the Cold War sort of
the World War III. Yeah, sure. Okay, well, considering the threat of Russia, and I read some commentary from Dennis Gartman yesterday. I'm not a big Gartman fan, frankly, but I thought it was interesting what he said. He says that that Putin's military is incompetent, essentially. He's saying that it is a conscription army comprised of alcoholics and Muslims that won't take orders from drunken Russians. He scoffs at Putin's statement that he could be in the Ukraine in 2 weeks, saying that if he could be, he would have already been there. What do you think? Is there any reason to fear the Russian bear?
I think there is always a reason to fear someone that has their finger on a nuclear button. And lest we forget, they've only dismantled a small portion of their nuclear arsenal. So I'm not really concerned about the conscripted soldier. I'm worried about someone who has an axe to grind and a nuclear weapon at their fingertips. Not just one, but thousands.
Yeah. All right. Well, these are geopolitical issues. To what extent do you think they threaten the American, or the equity markets, which has got America's more prosperous people feeling pretty good about things again? I mean, they may. I seriously believe that the average person in the country and the middle class is being hollowed out like I've never seen in my lifetime. But, people on Wall Street and a lot of people that I know that are doing very well, and there seems to be a one-way street on this equity market. And as David Stockman has said on this show, whenever the market throws a hissy fit, in comes more stimulus into the equity markets. And, everything is right with the world again as far as the affluent members of our society are concerned. How far can this thing go? I mean, do you see some threats to our system as a result of these geopolitical issues, or are the geopolitical issues, I think maybe as you were suggesting earlier, are a result of some of the problems internally? And the equity market, what is your view on the equity market at this point in time?
Sure. Well, I mean, you mentioned faith earlier and sort of the style of leadership that Reagan brought to this country. I think faith has shifted in terms of the object of faith. And today, if you wanted to say who are the high priests and who is the God, it is the marketplace, and the high priests are there at the Fed. And our faith is undyingly in their ability to create a context of stability. And that is to literally excuse all of the things that we've just discussed in terms of geopolitical issues, political issues, even economic and financial issues. All can be assumed to be well taken care of as long as the central banks of the world are printing money. That is the mode of operation in the marketplace. And I think, frankly, it's a fairly frail vantage point to be standing upon. We look at the markets today and say, we're reaching new highs in the equity markets on incredibly low volume in the summer months. That generally does not spell success in the autumn. It hasn't in the past. When we've seen those similar types of patterns, it's generally been a disaster in the fall. There's no guarantee that that's the case. We've got the ECB bringing out the big guns. We've got Karuta, who can certainly redouble his efforts and destroy the yen, and who knows what rabbits can be pulled out of the hat at the Fed. But we know that, again, this is a faith issue. The marketplace has misplaced their faith in the Fed. We had a lovely conversation several months ago on our commentary with William White from the Bank of International Settlements and the OECD. And after spending an entire career at the Bank of England as an economist and the Bank of Canada as an economist, he basically said this: central bankers have no idea what they're doing. We make it up as we go along and hope we don't get it too wrong in the process. So this idea that the markets have a massive amount of faith placed in the perfectly executed monetary policies of the central banks of our day, I think it's setting us up for disaster. I think it's setting us up for a disaster and sort of a foundering of faith, but for good reason.
Yeah, well, David, it wasn't that long ago that there was a loss of faith in the PhD standard, as James Grant calls it, with our PhD, all these PhDs at the Federal Reserve, divining how much money should be created and so on and so forth. How soon we forget, though. How soon people forget. It's incredible to me. So, what are you telling your investors, your clients to do? I mean, it's always, I know that we talk on this show about the importance of putting your savings into real money that will retain its value, gold and silver. But beyond that, what are you telling people to do these days?
Well, I think this is really fundamental. If you have equity exposure, you either need to hedge it or sell it. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind you can go from high to higher prices, and you can see valuations go from sort of the outer edges to even greater extremes. I mean, we basically have one more barrier to cross, and that is the valuation metrics of 1999 and 2000. We're sort of the most overvalued, other than 1999 and 2000, in a 100-year history. And, that to me is a bit concerning. It's a good reminder, of course, that valuations can get even crazier from here. But you're really playing a mug's game if this is how you expect to make money. The greater fool theory is what some have called it, where you're buying today, hoping that some other greater fool comes in and buys your position tomorrow, with the equal expectation of future success. So I think getting out of equities makes sense. If you're not getting out, at least hedging your position makes sense. And then the question is, what do you do with a cash position? I think you sit comfortably in cash and hedge your cash position unless you have complete and total faith in Janet Yellen's ability to manage your money for you, which is essentially what you'd be doing sitting in cash. Create a balanced position between U.S. dollar cash and physical gold. Okay, you've got something in the equity market, hedge it to some degree, reduce that exposure, increase your cash position, but also hedge your cash position having physical gold. I think you look at a gold-Dow ratio today of about 13.5 to 1, and I think what you're looking at as a gold investor is a golden opportunity to increase your financial footprint a minimum 4.5 times as we go to a 3-to-1 ratio from these levels, and potentially a 1-to-1 ratio, which would increase your financial footprint upwards of 12 times. To put in simple terms, if you wanted to own one share of Johnson & Johnson today, what I'm suggesting is that with a little bit of patience, a gold owner is going to be buying 4.5 to 12 shares with the same money. That's the value of real money set to the sidelines, ready and willing to be reallocated at an appropriate time. That's kind of our mindset. It's what we do with our wealth management company. It's what we do with the precious metals. And what we want to encourage folks is to take a very proactive stance, not only in protecting their capital today, but being in a position to put that money to work for them very effectively with a strategy over the next 2, 3, 4 years.
Well, I think that's an excellent strategy, and I might just remind my listeners, if they're not aware, that it was only in 1980 that we did approach a 1-to-1 Dow to gold ratio. I want to thank you very much, David. We're out of time. There's what we'll have to leave it at today. I want to thank you very much for coming on, and I'd like to tell my listeners once again, it's McAlvany.com. Go there for a wealth of very valuable and interesting information. David, thank you very much for being with us again. It's really appreciated.
Thank you, Jay.